There are few more cherished beliefs in modern medicine than the idea that saturated fat will clog your arteries and kill you, or that statins will save you from this fate. These two beliefs are so ingrained in medicine that they're beyond questioning. The problem is that science that cannot be questioned is not science. It's dogma. And dogma can be dangerous. This is the evidence pyramid, also known as the research hierarchy. It ranks study designs by their risk of bias. Study designs most likely to be biased are down the bottom. The poorest level of evidence within this hierarchy is that of expert opinion. In essence, expert opinion is the reliance on eminent individuals or organisations to deign what they consider to be the truth. And another phrase for this is eminence-based medicine. Basically, relying on the credentials rather than facts, taking whatever we've been told on faith. Eminence-based medicine is more about the messenger than the message. This is a tweet from a very well-credentialed cardiologist, and when he and I had differing views on a topic, he resorted to an appeal to authority, a case of simply, trust me, I'm an expert, without any scientific substantiation. The problem is, blind faith in any authority can lead us astray. And by authority, I also include bodies and institutions who often publish official guidelines and commentaries. And it's easier than you think to be misled by eminence-based medicine, even for doctors. I received this email from a family doctor with more than 30 years clinical experience, and even she was having trouble deciphering the science on statins. Her medical group was pushing her to increase her judicious prescribing of statins. Basically, they wanted every single one of her diabetic patients to take a statin, irrespective of their cholesterol level. So she decided to look at the science, and she came across this, an expert commentary claiming that taking statins would help her diabetic patients to live longer, that it would afford them a mortality benefit. And this doctor asked for my opinion as to whether this expert opinion was reliable. And I was immediately curious because I've extensively reviewed the literature on statins, and I wasn't aware of any research that proved a significant mortality benefit. So I went to the evidence cited within this expert commentary, and they cited 6 studies that supported this notion that taking a statin would help a diabetic patient live longer. Now, 3 of these 6 references were cited on the basis that they specifically proved this effect. The problem was, none of these 3 studies actually reached statistical significance. That is, these findings could be explained by random chance. Hardly reliable evidence. However, things got even worse when I looked at the remaining 3 studies. These didn't even look at mortality. Now, it's obvious that a study can only make findings about something which it actually looks at. Now, it beggars belief that experts would make mistakes with all 6 of their supporting citations. Literally, none of the studies they cited in support of the mortality claim in actual fact did so. Charitably speaking, they must have been more confused than a chameleon in a bucket of Skittles. And dietary guidelines too are another form of expert evidence, except with the backing of governments, they can wield immense influence. The problem is, our dietary guidelines were born of bad science and still have not recovered. The origins of our modern dietary guidelines date back to 1977 with a US Select Committee meeting on nutrition, which was convened by this man you see here, Senator McGovern. And while ostensibly this committee was set up to evaluate the science, when you mix science with politics, you get politics. And indeed, that's what we got. Robert Olson, a leading scientist of the day, pleaded with Senator McGovern to allow for a complete review of the science. But this is Senator Olson cajoling, pleading.
I argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist has of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
Basically, McGovern said to Olson, would like to, but we're politicians, we don't do science. And McGovern's refusal to allow a proper scientific process, I believe, was pivotal in the end result. You see, even in 1977, there were more than 70 randomised controlled trials against the notion of restricting dietary saturated fat. And despite this evidence, failure of the scientific process, driven by a political agenda, resulted in the production of dietary goals for the United States, which recommended the avoidance of saturated fat. And these dietary goals evolved into dietary guidelines under the watchful eye of this lady, the vegetarian-leaning Louise Light. Though again, not without significant political influence. Louise recounts how initially her team recommended grain consumption be limited to 2 to 3 serves daily. And after review by her masters in the Office of the Secretary of Agriculture, this was inexplicably increased to 6 to 11 serves per day, perhaps to help reduce a massive grain surplus brought about by government policies. And this recommendation, you can see, made its way into the food pyramid, down in the bottom right. Furthermore, Louise recounts that Congress legislated to compel all of the feeding programs administered by the USDA, including school, breakfast and lunch, daycare programs, so on and so forth, to meet this expanded grain requirement. In other words, this ridiculous quota was mandated by law. How's that for influence? And while we've done away with the food pyramid, the plate which replaced it still decries saturated fat. One not so subtle shift in recent times has been an increasing hostility to red meat, again without a valid scientific basis. The fact is, those who made our current dietary guidelines, as with Senator McGovern, have resisted calls for a scientific process. As a part of the public consultation process during the development of our guidelines, this submission was made. It requested that a comprehensive evaluation of the science into carbs and fat be conducted. And yet this request was dismissed out of hand with this non sequitur claiming there was insufficient evidence to institute a review of the evidence. To me, this looks like obstruction of what was meant to be a scientific process. Of course, this obstruction didn't extend to every submission. This one, which looks suspiciously like it was from industry, received a positive response, the committee seeming to agree with the notion of encouraging the consumption of junk food. The problem is, reviews without a systematic process to evaluate the science risk selective referencing of the literature, cherry picking, if you will. This is incredibly common amongst expert commentaries and guidelines. In the 1960s, for example, there were 4 trials that specifically examined the effect of modifying the diet in the prevention of heart disease. And only one, the Oslo study, found any suggestion of benefit from restricting saturated fat. With this network review here, the small circles represent subsequent review papers to these 4 interventional studies, and the connectors showing which of these 4 studies they referenced. You can see the outlier study, shown by the big blue circle, was by far the most referenced paper. Concerningly, It was often the only referenced paper by a good number of these review papers. This is cherry-picking in action. We also see that cholesterol-lowering trials with favourable outcomes are cited 6 times more often than those with unfavourable outcomes. In effect, a single paper in favour of lowering cholesterol will have the same degree of citation influence as 6 papers finding no benefit. This results in a huge distortion in our perception of scientific findings. At the end of the day, expert opinion, including dietary guidelines, is at the very bottom of the evidence hierarchy. Now, dragging ourselves up off the bottom, we get to mechanistic studies. Mechanistic studies, in the purest sense, occupy themselves with understanding the underlying reactions and mechanisms, often at a molecular level, that lead to disease. Let's take a look at an example of the misuse of mechanistic research to propagate the myth that red meat causes bowel cancer. You may remember this 2015 World Health Organization report, which claimed that red meat causes bowel cancer. It led to a worldwide media frenzy. This conclusion, however, was based on completely unsound science. This is one of the mechanistic studies cited in this paper as providing experimental evidence that red meat causes bowel cancer. It is a study on rats which were injected with a chemical called azoxymethane and then subsequently fed either white meat or blood sausage. Now, azoxymethane is a toxic chemical specifically used to induce bowel cancer in animals. That's what it does. The fact is, by being injected with azoxymethane, the rats in this study were likely to develop bowel cancer no matter what diet they were on. Except none of the rats in this study actually did develop bowel cancer. None. None in the white meat group, none in the blood sausage group. There were precancerous lesions, that is to say, not cancer, but even these were evenly distributed between the 2 groups. Could there have been a better study to prove that red meat doesn't cause bowel cancer? And yet the authors of this World Health Organization report cited this as evidence that red meat causes cancer. You can't even make this up. After you've processed that, ask yourself, could this have been an honest mistake? And for what it's worth, I consider animal research to be at the level of mechanistic evidence. The fact is, there are significant physiological differences between animals and humans, which severely limits the extrapolation of any findings. Take thalidomide, a drug unleashed on pregnant mothers to treat morning sickness. It has devastating consequences on unborn humans. And yet, this effect is not seen in rats. Clearly, findings in animal studies do not always translate to humans. A point that didn't seem to bother Nikolay Anikov, who posited that dietary cholesterol causes atherosclerosis in humans, on the basis of research where he fed rabbits cholesterol dissolved in vegetable oil. Now, this is not to say that all animal research should be discounted. For example, in this study, 44 rats were given an experimental cholesterol-lowering drug. You're looking at the sole survivor, the other 43 having died. Now, if this research had been taken as a warning and followed up by more specialised human research, it might have prevented this cholesterol-lowering drug, tryparanol, from ever being brought to market. A move which would have saved thousands of people from needless suffering, including this 10-year-old boy who you can see with a permanent cataract. Moving on, research performed using poor or unreliable surrogate markers should also reside at this level of mechanistic studies. A surrogate marker is a measure that we associate with a clinically meaningful endpoint. For example, we might equate blood glucose levels with the harms caused by diabetes. Problems arise, however, when a surrogate marker does not reliably relate to the clinical endpoint in question. One example of this is the biomarker, LDL, long associated with cardiovascular disease. So much so that nutrition research on cardiovascular disease measures LDL in place of objective outcomes like actual heart attacks. Convenient, but scientifically flawed. You see, the relationship between LDL and heart disease is not reliable. The best data we have actually suggests the relationship is backwards. This is a systematic review of 19 prospective cohort studies, which is an appropriate methodology to assess for the presence of a relationship. And with more than 68,000 participants, it was well powered. And it found that lower LDL levels were in fact associated with an increased chance of dying. And there is no credible evidence to the contrary. And while this doesn't prove that lowering LDL will make you live longer, it sure makes a mockery of those who use LDL as a surrogate marker. To do so is likely to lead in incorrect or misleading research findings. Let's now move up to the next rung of the evidence ladder, case series and case reports. Now, case series and reports document often unusual or novel occurrences that may be both instructive to other clinicians and help guide future medical research. And this is an example of a case study, albeit an unusually large one. It found that of 2,029 participants following a carnivore diet, 95% reported improved health. It must be said, however, that this in no way provides evidence of causation. Rather, as with mechanistic studies, case studies are more valuable for hypothesis generation. Now let's climb up the ladder to observational studies. This is what we know as epidemiology. This methodology examines the associations between diseases and other factors. For example, it might look at the amount of red meat that we consume versus heart disease. The key point to understand, however, and I cannot stress this enough, is that observational epidemiological research can never, and I repeat, never, demonstrate causality. If you don't think this cat crushed that roof, then you instinctively understand that just because two events associate together, because they occur at the same time, doesn't provide evidence that one caused the other. The fact is, however, that this is the single most pervasive and pernicious error made in the interpretation of research. Let's look at some real-world examples involving red meat. Now, there are countless headlines decrying red meat from every conceivable angle. These headlines are all based on observational and epidemiological research, which is hopelessly impacted by something called confounding. A confounder is a factor other than what is actually being studied that can also influence the results. Let's, for example, assume we'd like to study the impact of red meat on diabetic control. First, we might look at the intake of red meat in the diet. Now, all of these foods are commonly categorised as being red meat in observational research. Do you see any potential confounders? Is it possible that the pizza crust or the hamburger bun might have an impact on blood glucose level? Are they also likely to be consumed with a soft drink or French fries? The fact is, these confounders are impossible to adequately control, despite what some mischievous researchers will claim. Nutritional epidemiology is further weakened by difficulties in quantifying amounts consumed. How many bread rolls have you consumed in the last 12 months? Now, current audience aside, for most people, this is an impossible question. Most people struggle to remember what they've had for breakfast. Further confounding observational research is something called the healthy user bias. This refers to the tendency of some subjects to engage in healthier behaviours than others. Now, given the hostility to red meat in the media, people who are concerned about their health are more likely to restrict their intake of red meat. These are also the same people who are likely to exercise, to not smoke, to drink in moderation, make sure they get enough sleep. The fact is, observational research stacks the deck against red meat, which makes headlines such as these laughable. Now, while they're all technically correct, in that the words linked and associated themselves do not infer causality, this is not how most people interpret them. The average person, and dare I say the average doctor, will look at these headlines and conclude that red meat must be unhealthy. I recently saw another case of the misuse of observational research shown to me by a patient. So he'd gone to his cardiologist and he'd questioned him why he had been prescribed so many drugs. And he was shown this graph that was from an observational study. And it shows the survival rate for patients after heart attacks versus the number of medications they're taking. You can see that patients on 0 medications have a higher mortality rate than those prescribed 1, 2 or 3 medications. The thing is, however, when I went and actually reviewed the paper from which this graph was derived, it was very clear that the patients with the very worst risk factors of heart disease were the ones who were given the least medications. The healthier you were, the more drugs you got. Something that was perhaps not apparent to the cardiologist who used this as a basis to encourage polypharmacy. I'd like to now talk about a relatively new study methodology called Mendelian randomization. And this type of study has significant weaknesses meriting its placement quite low down in the pyramid, below even observational studies. Now, Mendelian randomization studies appear to be intimidating and inaccessible, being based largely on genetics and statistics. And this unfortunately results in a tendency of deference to experts, where claims made on the basis of these studies remain unchallenged. Take the example of this study, which found that variation in the PCSK9 gene encoding proteins associated with LDL regulation was associated with cardiovascular disease. Accordingly, the authors claimed proof that LDL was causally associated with heart disease. The fact is, however, these studies are not that hard to understand, and they're more smoke and mirrors than anything. In reality, they're glorified observational studies. First of all, this study started with a particular genetic variant of the PCSK9 gene known to influence LDL levels. This genetic variant was then used as a surrogate marker for elevated LDL levels. Importantly, an association was also observed between this PCSK9 variant and heart disease. However, this time, the increased rate of heart disease was not attributed to the genetic variant itself, but rather the elevated LDL. Now, from what you already know about associations and surrogate markers, you can tell that this is fallacious reasoning at best. The fact is, there's something called genetic pleiotropy, where a single genetic variant can impact multiple physical traits. In this scenario, several known influences of the PCSK9 gene could each plausibly increase the risk of heart disease. For example, PCSK9 gene variants are known to impact on glucose metabolism, triglyceride levels, inflammatory markers, blood clotting, and more. Given this plethora of effects, it's entirely unreasonable for these researchers to conclude that an observed increase in cardiac events must have been due to the associated rise in LDL. The fact is, Mendelian randomisation studies are glorified observational studies, despite which they're increasingly being used to support tenuous claims. Most commonly, that there is a causal role for LDL in cardiovascular disease. Now, this unwarranted conclusion inhabits the space between nonsense and absurdity. This type of research should remain planted firmly in the shallow end of the gene pool with those who make such claims. Next up, we have non-randomised control trials. In this type of study, participants are allocated to different treatment groups by a process that is not random. This may be the choice of the researcher or the preference of the participants. To understand why this methodology is inferior to a fully randomised trial, you need to understand the placebo effect, most easily understood as the power of expectation. If a subject truly believes that a particular intervention is going to be beneficial, they will likely to perceive benefit irrespective of whether one is present or not. And if either the researcher or subject is able to funnel the study participants into a particular group, the placebo effect is likely to come into play. Having said this, non-randomised controlled trials, while not being gold standard, are still useful. For example, this 2-year-long non-randomised control study of 349 subjects who received either standard diabetic care or a ketogenic diet found striking benefit with the ketogenic diet. Ultimately, without higher quality randomised control studies, uncontrolled studies like this can still inform our scientific understanding, albeit with some appreciation for their inherent limitations. Next, we come to randomised control trials, widely considered to be the gold standard of research. And unlike other studies, these can control for confounders. Random allocation of subjects to different treatment groups means that confounding variables are randomly and with enough numbers evenly distributed, which effectively nullifies their influence. All that is required is random allocation and enough subjects. The end result being that causation can be shown. Hence, randomised controlled trials are considered the gold standard of research. Of course, not every randomised controlled trial is equal. You'll recall how the use of poor surrogate markers can effectively downgrade research. Well, this also includes randomised controlled trials. Simply put, the use of poor surrogate markers can result in false conclusions being drawn, even by randomised controlled trials. Take, for example, the use of bone density as a surrogate marker to predict fracture risk. On the face of it, this seems reasonable. What then of fluoride, which has been proven to increase bone mineral density, while at the same time increasing fracture risk? I'm going to trust the randomised controlled trial that used the objective clinical marker of fracture rate rather than the surrogate marker of bone density. Another example of randomised controlled trials using surrogate markers and coming to erroneous conclusions is this study on torcetrapib, a drug proven to both increase HDL and lower LDL, something once considered to be the holy grail of heart disease prevention. Except when a trial using mortality as an outcome was performed, it was found that torcetrapib increased the death rate by 58%. The fact is, the use of objective clinical outcomes matters, all-cause mortality being my preferred measure. First, it's clear and unambiguous. Even mischievous researchers will have trouble misclassifying someone based on mortality. Next is clinical relevance. Now, things don't get much more relevant than whether you're dead or alive. And finally, all-cause mortality allows weighting of both beneficial and unknown negative impacts of an intervention. For example, a treatment might reduce the cause of death from heart attacks at the same time while increasing the risk of death from cancer. Looking at either outcome in isolation wouldn't tell the full story. And don't fall for the argument that lifespan is not a valid measure because it doesn't reflect health span. In actual fact, research clearly demonstrates that interventions that increase lifespan do so by delaying the onset of chronic disease. That is, increased lifespan also sees an increase in health span. So we then come to the pointy end of the evidence hierarchy: systematic reviews of randomised control trials. These basically compile the findings of all available randomised control trials. And systematic reviews, though, they're not perfect because they're only as good as the studies they review. If the selection criteria of the systematic review permits the inclusion of methodologically weak randomised control trials, such as those using surrogate markers, the overall findings of the systematic review itself may also be flawed. This is why different systematic reviews, even on the same topic, can come to different conclusions. For example, 2 systematic reviews have found that limiting saturated fat offers a mortality benefit, a finding not found by 9 other systematic reviews on the same question. With this in mind, there is something called an umbrella review, which is a systematic review of systematic reviews. And this is an example of an umbrella review, which reviewed 17 systematic reviews of randomised controlled trials which studied the relationship between dietary fat to heart disease or mortality. That's a long sentence. The ultimate conclusion was that low-fat diets do not indeed reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. However, I suspect that even this won't be the last word on this topic. So after all of that, this is what you've left with. Now, studies using research methodologies towards the top of this pyramid are more likely to have accurate findings. This, however, is still far from guaranteed. And nobody makes that point better than Professor John Ioannidis. He identified 17 of the most influential medical journals and scoured them for highly cited studies over a 13-year period, from 1990 to 2003. And he found 49 highly cited original research articles published within this 13-year period. He then went and reviewed more recent research of similar or better quality on the topics covered by these influential papers. And he found a disturbing number of findings had subsequently been overturned. Predictably, this was worse for observational research. 5 out of 6 influential observational studies were contradicted by subsequent, more recent and better quality research. But randomised controlled trials too were found to be problematic. Ioannidis found that the results of 9 of the 39 randomised controlled trials were contradicted by later research, almost a quarter. The fact is, research conclusions should not simply be taken at face value. It should be incumbent on all health professionals to personally appraise the literature which informs their opinions. The fact is, this doesn't happen nearly often enough. And until it does, everyone should take some responsibility for their own health and not be afraid to ask hard questions of their doctors. And who knows, you might even take them on a journey of discovery. Thank you.